Welcome to this edition of On Politics. I'm Dr. Eric Morrow at Tarleton State University, and we're glad you're joining us this week. We are here every week at noon on KTRL FM 90.5 and streaming on the internet at tarletonradio.com. You can also catch us after the show on SoundCloud to download today's or previous episodes, and you can also find us where you download your podcast. So as we work to do almost on a weekly basis to bring you quality interviews on very critical topics, it's my pleasure today to welcome Dr. Bruce Bechtel, professor at San Angelo State University. We're glad he's joining us today because he is one of the foremost experts on the Koreas and on that part of the world in East Asia, formerly faculty at the Marine Corps Command and Staff College and the Air Command Staff College. He also served as an adjunct visiting professor at the Korea University Graduate School of International Studies. He served as a senior analyst for Northeast Asia in the Intelligence Directorate and the Joint Staff in the Pentagon. And he is author of the recent book, North Korean Military Proliferation to the Middle East and Africa, Enabling Violence and Instability. And the one before that, North Korea and Regional Security in the Kim Jong-un Era, a New International Security Dilemma. Dr. Bechtel, we're glad to have you with us today.
Glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, we try to bring in international issues on a regular basis on this show, especially our broadcast and the Cross Timbers area. We reach into the Fort Worth area some as well, but with our mix of local, state, national as well, international issues need attention as well. And I think that's really my first question for you today with your background and the research that you've done and the experiences that you've had. Why is East Asia and specifically what happens on the Korean Peninsula, why should that be important to the average person? Not just, and I'm looking at this in a global view, not just saying, for Americans, but why should we have an awareness of what's happening in that part of the world?
Well, I'm happy to talk about it just as an American, since you and I are Americans. But let's talk economics and then talk security, because those are the two biggies for us in East Asia, specifically Northeast Asia. You know, in the Korean War in 1950, when Harry Truman took us to war, the streets in Seoul weren't even paved. And I don't know if you've been to Seoul any time in the past few years, but it's more modern than any city I've ever been to in America. The place has really changed. We went to war with those guys to help them in 1950 with 19 UN member states because it was the right thing to do, not because it had any effect on us regionally or economically. That has all changed. If you look at our relationship with South Korea now, of course, I have a bias because my wife's Korean. So, of course, we all drive Kias. And we just got an LG microwave. But, I mean, beyond that, Koreans have become an integral part, and Korean Americans, of American society, including here in Texas, in places like the Dallas-Fort Worth area as well. South Korea is our sixth largest trading partner. South Korea has the 10th largest GDP on Earth, which makes them an economic powerhouse. And at the same time, you have right on their border another nation that's also of Koreans, and now we're getting into the security side, where they have been malnourished for so long that the average North Korean is a full head shorter than the average South Korean. It's quite compelling. This is also a nation that has nuclear weapons, and they have a platform that can carry them at least to the west coast of the United States, ballistic missiles. So we have a very compelling threat. They have the world's fifth largest military, next to Eritrea. That's the country I'm thinking of. Next to Eritrea, North Korea has the highest demographic state of men in the military compared to their population. Only Eritrea has it higher. Don't ask me why. I'm not an African specialist. You have one there, though, and I met him. He's very good. So we are facing that right now. And we have 28,000 American troops there. We have a modern Air Force base. We just, with a lot of money from the South Koreans, $9 million, built beautiful new facilities down at near Pyeongtaek. So when we're talking security, we're both facing the North Korean threat, a nation state that is in disruption right now for a lot of reasons, including the COVID virus. And we're talking about change in our alliance because President Trump has told the South Koreans that they need to ante up a lot more money to pay for U.S. troops to be on the peninsula, which is something I'd love to talk more about. It's something I've been writing about in recent times. A lot of Americans know a whole lot about what's going on with NATO. You know, the only NATO country that's really paid what they're supposed to pay by treaty, which is 2% of their GDP, has been the United Kingdom. And so you've got these other modern, vibrant nation states that just refuse to pay their fair share. That's not the case with South Korea, and I can get into that in detail with you if you'd like, but it is certainly something that is up for a great debate right now, because in South Korea, their biggest worry has always been, is the United States going to pull out and leave us someday? So I'll just leave it there.
Well, so the U.S. has had a significant presence in that part of the world. In the 20th century, we saw that. And of course, coming from our background in political science and seeing how some of that has changed. I mean, one that I'm familiar with is the shift from, the idea of the U.S. being the hub of the wheel that kind of tried to pull all that together, to then the focus on the war on terror. Here lately, we hear so much about China, about trade, about other issues back and forth. But East and South Asia is a huge region with a huge population, and there are a lot of other issues and things that are happening that influence the rest of the world. What are some of those significant issues that most people don't hear about that we should be aware of in terms of what's happening in especially East Asia?
Well, certainly I just briefly mentioned North Korea's nuclear weapons. That's a big deal. That's certainly a big deal to its neighbors, particularly South Korea and Japan, because they have the platforms to launch those nuclear weapons. They have ballistic missiles that have ranges from 300 kilometers all the way up to 12,000 kilometers. So that's a big security issue. Right now, in Asia, believe it or not, cyber warfare and the robbery of banks and businesses and the attack on military targets and government targets and the press, the free press, by North Korean cyber experts has been a big deal, getting larger. And ironically, and I haven't written about this yet, so you're the first to hear about this. In looking at the trends, because North Korea just started really using cyber warfare about 6 years ago. In looking at the trends, they've made a switch, not a total switch, but they placed their efforts, their emphasis now more on attacking banks and other financial institutions to get money for the state than they have on attacking military targets and government targets. So, I mean, to me, that's just another sign that the sanctions that are on North Korea are working. Another thing about the North Koreans is they sell arms, everything from small arms. They sell the Type 73 machine gun, which is basically a copy of a Russian-made machine gun from the Cold War era, to the Syrians, the Iranians, the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, etc. All in my book, which, by the way, is available on Amazon.com. And they sell everything from that rifle through tanks, aircraft, chemical weapons, and, of course, nuclear weapons in the Middle East. And so we've seen that. The UN panel of experts reports have been very good about telling us about that. So I think what's interesting about that, and quite compelling as well, is the fact that this ties Asia to the Middle East. And now we've just seen a huge treaty signed, or agreement, I guess you'd call it, between China and Iran everything from, construction projects to military aid or military buying. China's not going to give them anything. Just signed between China and Iran. So China's obviously trying to get a footprint over there. And I think that leads to something many of your listeners have probably been seeing a bit on the news, which is, the Chinese-American Cold War that seems to be developing fairly rapidly, much more rapidly than I thought I would. But a lot of us who study Asia for a living, yourself included, probably thought that this was inevitable sooner or later. And so we're seeing that. I would expect, the kind of people that listen to a show like this are going to be the kind of people who read newspapers a lot and read journal articles and books and things like that. I would expect you'll see a lot more about China's, the new China-U.S. Cold War, where it's very different than the two systems that the USSR and the USA had during the first Cold War, where it was really a battle of systems as much as it was a military confrontation. Well, China and the United States are both in the same global system. So it's going to be very interesting to see how, because this is all about IPE, International Political Economy. It's going to be interesting to see how our two economies go after each other, because we're in the same system. We sell to the same people. We invest in the same places. Our consumers consume largely the same types of things. There'll still be sides, the quote unquote good guys and bad guys. Hopefully we'll be the good guys. But, I think that's going to be a very compelling issue. I have many friends. Obviously, I'm a retired Marine. I spent 6 years after I retired working for the Defense Intelligence Agency in the Pentagon. And so I've always focused on military stuff. But in Asia, with the big economic powerhouses there, China, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, economics is what it's all about. And the economics that China has used to make itself the things they have done to make themselves an economic world power are going to be applied to their military. But it's the economics that I think gain the attention of President Trump. And I think that that's what's going to, no matter who the president is after this November, I think that's going to be a big deal on their plate, from day one.
So do you see U.S. foreign policy in that region? I mean, maybe we can even go back into the Obama administration, but bring it forward into the Trump administration. Or is that, do you see that anticipating some of this that's happening? I mean, what are we doing on our part to be able to engage with what's happening? Because I know, you talk about the expansion of China into the Middle East. China's been in Africa for a long time now in terms of the economic investment and infrastructure projects and so on. And it's a little bit different footprint, I would say, probably than the Middle East because of just the different dynamics and different types of countries and where they are on the international level. I just don't know how do you see how we've engaged with that with our foreign policy efforts. And this is kind of moving beyond just the kind of surface things of the meeting Kim Jong-un and all of the things the media has given attention to the more substantive things of how we're positioning ourselves.
Well, let me give you two anecdotal stories on that if I can, since we're in the kind of program where I can kind of ramble on a bit. Hopefully not too much. But I had a student 2 years ago write her thesis on China's involvement in Africa, which you just talked about. And she and her husband were both, I would call them bush pilots, but that's not probably what they're called. They worked for an NGO operating out of Mozambique that was going into Sudan on a routine daily basis and helping out with the human rights situation there. And as she was doing this and going to school online with me, she was seeing Chinese everywhere in Sudan. And it really piqued her interest, so she decided to write a paper about it. Great paper. She's now the vice president of that NGO, and her paper scared the living daylights out of me because there are certain rules, international norms that nation states like the United States follow, and the Chinese government does not follow those rules. And another anecdotal story about China and Africa was, everybody knows who studies Africa a lot. And as I said, you have an expert there who I've actually drank beers with. He's a great guy. And he, by the way, did a reference for a book that one of my friends here in our department wrote on Africa. So thank you. But yes. He and I were talking about Nigeria and how corrupt Nigeria is. And what's so crazy about that is Nigeria is probably less corrupt than a lot of other sub-Saharan African countries. But Nigeria got so corrupt and was so filled with violence that a lot of the American oil companies, like from here in Texas, just pulled out, said, we can't do this. We're not going to do this. We're not going to hire 400 guys with machine guns to patrol our pipeline just because you can't keep people from trying to steal oil. You know who went in and was happy to do that? The Chinese. So, we can expect, I think, to see a lot of that in the Middle East. I think the big difference is, most of the countries, certainly in sub-Saharan Africa, except for South Africa, perhaps, are very poor. And so, a lot of loans from China, a lot of, if you let us build this, we'll build this for free, but then you got to let us use your port facilities type stuff. That does not exist in the Middle East. Iran's a rich country, because of oil. And so I think a lot of this is as much strategic as it is economic. And it's certainly something that rates watching in coming years. Now, what else is it you wanted me to talk about?
How we're preparing in terms of our own foreign policy and engagements in those regions, or at least do you see this kind of building to counter China in any way in those areas or regions, or how do you perceive that both the previous and current administration are trying to navigate this going forward?
Well, I don't want to sound like a partisan Republican or a partisan Democrat. And I guess I really don't need to, because in this case, it applies to both. We were kidding ourselves when it came to the Chinese. And you look like you're younger than me. I'm 60, but I'm an old man. And neither of my daughters have given me grandchildren yet either, by the way, which is disappointing. But, going all the way back to George H.W. Bush, we were talking about China and the issues with China, the corruption, the human rights issues, the fact that if something was made in a factory in China, it was manufactured in a far different way than if it was made in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, for example. And I think that's very important. Presidents would always talk that when they were running for office, but once they got in, all these big American businesses who had so much money, still do, had so much money tied up in China, would always talk it down. And so we've basically been kidding ourselves for all these years. It's been at least 20 years now, as China's economy was booming, growing at a faster rate than every economy basically on earth, except for India, which I think is great. India grows faster because it's a democracy and there's less corruption. But, we see this and we keep, that'll get better. They'll fix it. No, everybody's seen what's going on in Hong Kong right now, and that's a preview of coming attractions. Everybody knows that when the Chinese get in an economic relationship with another country, it's far different than if we do, that is to say the United States, because they don't play by the same rules we do. And yet everybody kept killing themselves because so many Americans were making money hand over fist by their foreign direct investment in China. I think that has come to or close to a screeching halt now. There's many good things and bad things about what President Trump has done. But one of the great things that he's done, in my view, is get Americans, guys like you and me always look at it. But my daughter graduated from the University of Iowa, and Trump actually got farmers in Iowa talking about the China problem. And I think that's important. We have to all think of this as an issue not against the Chinese people, but against the Chinese Communist Party, the guys running that authoritarian government there who refuse to follow the same rules as everybody else in the global economy.
So we're right in the middle of a presidential election that will happen here in a few months. We all look at how that election is viewed within our own context here in this country, and of course, a significant amount of attention is given to that. But elections, U.S. elections are watched and are very critical in the way that they're viewed overseas and around the world, and especially in Asia. I mean, from North Korea or even China, what is the significance of not just a presidential election, but maybe this one? Do you see some critical things that governments and leaders are looking at from countries in that part of the world?
Well, that's a great question, by the way. Are you an Asian specialist?
Well, I almost went that direction. I took a summer of Mandarin. I was going to do East or Southeast Asia at some point, and I ended up going in a different direction. But I've taught a course on East Asia a couple of times, so that gives me a little bit of background.
Yeah, that's fun. It's fun. For whatever reason, I like being in Asia a lot more than I like being in Europe. Although I was in Geneva last September, and it is a beautiful city, I have to say. There is no place like Geneva in Texas. But you asked about, other countries watching us. I think, for example, because you brought up North Korea first, I think, for example, Kim Jong-un, without a doubt, is watching the American elections. I mean, we all are, because the elections right now look like they're going to be very close, not just for president, but for the House and for the Senate. Perhaps not in places like Texas, but a lot of other places, swing states it will, obviously. He's watching that because, I remember when Obama was running for president, he said he was going to talk to these authoritarian leaders. He didn't. I mean, his other people, Kerry obviously talked to the Iranians, et cetera. But Trump has talked to Kim Jong-un, and what we've seen is kind of a tap down, if you will, in the rhetoric and in the tension. Now, North Korea has not done anything that should make us lift sanctions against them. They still sell, chemical weapons to Syria, for example. They still abuse the human rights of their own people in ways that would just shock the average American. But at least they're not talking about pointing nuclear-tipped missiles at us. That's a good thing. Will that stop when, if, I don't know if it's when or not, but if Biden wins the election, how will that bode on the relationship that we have had with North Korea since 2018? The answer to that is, I don't know. Because I'm sure you watch politics as much as I do, the Biden folks have not really talked about their Asia policy, hardly at all. Not just North Korea or South Korea, but Japan, which we haven't talked a lot about today, but Japan is a huge ally, 50,000 troops, fourth largest trading partner. I have always argued that they don't need ballistic missile defense because they've got Godzilla. He can just slap those missiles down in the sky. But, very important allies, economic and military issues over there haven't been discussed by Biden yet, largely because, I really don't want to blame him or anybody else, largely because, as you know, and every American knows, the coronavirus has just cast a shadow over everything. That's all everybody's talked about, probably with pretty good reason, for the past 4 or 5 months. So we'll see. I don't know, but like you, I'll be watching. I think the Chinese are watching this election. Getting back to Joe Biden, I know that his son was set on the boards of a couple of Chinese companies. that may all be coming to a screeching halt. I mean, how can we? I mean, we went through this before, right? I mean, like I said, I'm an old man. I was a gunnery sergeant in the Marine Corps in 1989 when Tiananmen happened, and I remember being in the staff NCO barracks in Kaneohe, Hawaii, and watching that brave young Chinese kid who just stood in front of the tank. Remember that? Yes. And I said, that has to be the coolest dude in Asia. You know what I mean? Are we going to get back to that? It looks like we are, with Hong Kong. Everybody thought or hoped or told themselves that as China advanced economically, that they would move closer to democracy, because we saw that happen in Taiwan and Singapore and South Korea, even in Japan. We haven't seen that in China. So, I mean, you can go to a disco in Shanghai and spend $400 on fancy tequila drinks, but the CCP is still going to be watching you when you go home. That's going to be an issue, I think, for the Biden administration. And we already know what direction the Trump administration will take if they get reelected. We know the direction they're going. So I think that is a big question. If Biden gets elected, how will he approach China as opposed to how President Trump has approached it?
Well, Dr. Bechtel, I want to thank you for joining us today. We're running close on time here, and they're all interesting areas and directions we could go with this. And I would love to have you back on in the future as well, because I know these issues are going to be with us, and we already see some direction based on what you've shared with us today. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, sir, for inviting me. It's an honor.
We will take a short break, and we will be back with more On Politics.
Politics can be confusing, but On Politics with Eric Morrow has your back. Follow the show on Facebook. Search On Politics with Eric Morrow to stay up to date with the show and all the sources to follow right along.
Welcome back to On Politics. I'm Dr. Eric Morrow at Tarleton State University. And today, for the second half of our show, we are joined by Luis Figueroa, who is the Legislative and Policy Director of Every Texan, formerly the Center for Public Policy Priorities. And we're glad to have you on the show today, Luis. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited about this. Appreciate it.
Well, your experience, having worked in the Capitol with senators from El Paso and Houston, and in the area, and issues related to civil rights with the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, and now your policy focus with Every Texan. One of the things that I promised my listeners on the show is that we will get to the critical issues that will most likely be the focus, or maybe should be the focus, of the Texas legislature when they meet this coming January. And so I wanted to reach out to you and get your perspective on some of this so that we could give our listeners a little bit of a preview, or maybe some things to think about in terms of advocacy and engagement with what's going to be going on and what will be the kind of the challenges and issues that'll be at the forefront. Before we get into that, though, some people may not know what Every Texan is and what the focus is. So give us a little bit of background about what you do and what Every Texan does in terms of focus on policy and advocacy.
Absolutely. So as you mentioned, we are formerly the Center for Public Policy Priorities. One of the reasons we changed our names to Every Texan is because we fundamentally believe that social justice begins and requires policy. And, public policy is at the heart of social justice, in the sense that at the end of the day, you're trying to create a change to create equity, equity for people of color, equity for low income, equity for communities that have been marginalized in the state and the country. And so that is our niche. Our niche is working on policy. We have some of the experts in the areas of healthcare, Medicaid, school finance, budget and tax policy. We work on immigrant rights. We work on access to food. So, those fundamental issues that are about uplifting communities and those policy needs at the state, in local, state, and federal level. But I will say we spend a lot more time on the state level with our proximity to Austin and our expertise on state level policy.
Well, knowing some of those areas that you've mentioned are not only ongoing concerns and challenges and certainly major issues of focus in the state of Texas, we're in the middle of a pandemic. It's hit Texas very hard in terms of the demand on healthcare, on hospitalization, not to say those that have the lives that we've seen lost because of this, but what have you seen? What specific issues that you see have really moved to the forefront? And I'm asking that because I would expect these are probably going to be the focus of at least some legislators, if not many, in the upcoming session, especially those issues that you see are very challenging, given the policy areas that every Texan tries to address.
Absolutely. It's going to be such a very different looking session in this pandemic environment. COVID-19 has really been a game changer in so many ways. But what it has done is highlighted the inequities that have always existed, the inequities in healthcare coverage. And so we spent the beginning part of the COVID really focusing on trying to get free testing and treatment for all communities, especially those that lack insurance, health insurance, and those that are immigrant populations. We focused on the unemployment. There were so many barriers to getting unemployment benefits. You may remember when everyone was starting to really lose their jobs and furloughs and layoffs were happening. People were having a really hard time accessing the Texas Workforce Commission to apply for their unemployment benefits. Access to food was a huge issue. Many children, their meals come from school. And so when you close down schools, we saw those huge lines in San Antonio for people trying to access food services at the food pantry and food banks. And so we worked on trying to get electronic benefit transfers so that people could use a card and get access at other places and grocery stores. And so these are the fundamental inequities that were exposed because of COVID. And I think next session, one issue that I definitely want to highlight is the issue of Medicaid expansion. Other states, we are no longer, every state that borders Texas has now done Medicaid expansion, including Oklahoma and Arkansas and Louisiana, red states. And Texas is one of the few lone holdouts on this area. And so we are really trying to create some movement that suggests that we should really need to expand our access to health insurance because we are the state that leads the nation on the uninsured rate. So that's an area where COVID again has shown the inequities, and we're really hoping the legislature will address that in some manner.
You made that the connection with or talking about health insurance, and if we look back, and we seem to have made some progress when the Affordable Care Act was passed, and knowing the high rate, and I track this in my classes, and we talk with this about students, especially among children without access to health care, individuals, singles that were, individuals that may not have it provided through their employer and might have to look for it privately. And so it seems like you're saying, we're going back the other way now. A lot of this is connected with the challenges of poverty on the one hand, but also maybe underemployment and the lack of insurance maybe being provided by employers. And so you have families that just can't afford it. Where do you see some of those connections? I know every Texan has done a tremendous amount of work in the past focused on the effects of poverty in relationship to education and healthcare. Where do you see some of the critical issues there that may or may not be addressed in our legislative session? I mean, I think on one hand, and we'll get to this in a moment, the focus is really going to be on the budget and revenue and what budget constraints may be in place. But I think it's important that we keep these issues in front of us to know about the quality of life of people throughout the state and the struggles that they're finding. So a couple of connections here on these issues.
Yeah, well, let me start with where you started, the Affordable Care Act. Texas is one of the states with our Attorney General leading the way to repeal the Affordable Care Act that is going to be up in the United States Supreme Court pretty much right after the election. And of course, with that goes the coverage for pre-existing conditions, the subsidies for marketplace health insurance, and all the other protections that are created by the Affordable Care Act. We as a state have been very reluctant to pull the federal funds to draw the funds to increase access for health insurance for those who don't have it through their employer. And through COVID, as I mentioned before, with all these folks becoming unemployed and the growing unemployment rate, they're losing their health insurance with it, which means they have to either go to the marketplace or rely on Medicaid. And so that connection is going to become more and more clear that if we don't come up with a solution, Texas is going to be in a really bad shape if we don't have the access to the health care that so many children and adults rely on. Now, I will say on CHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Program, one of our advocates, Ann Dunkelberg, who's really the expert in this, was instrumental in passing the Children's Health Insurance Program. And so that has been one of the great programs in Texas, but we need to grow from that. One of the issues we worked on last session was that there's so many barriers for this continuous enrollment. So children oftentimes have to go back to the state agency to re-enroll for their health insurance. And what we have found is that every time you make them come back, you lose more and more kids, and you make them, fill out documentation, and you make them fill it out every month or every few months. That barrier results in people being dropped, even though they would totally still be eligible. So we were working on trying to get continuous eligibility last session. We were able to pass that through the House. It stalled in the Senate. We really hope that there will be some momentum to at least do that next session if we're not going to do Medicaid expansion. But the real answer is drawing those federal funds, which will not only help the uninsured, but it'll help save rural hospitals. It'll help save these healthcare providers that are in desperate need of these Medicaid dollars. And so it is a win-win across the board, and which is why red states all across the United States have been adopting it many times through ballot initiative, but also through the legislature.
We know that these issues are going to be impacted by the current budget crisis. Already, we saw it at an institution of higher education. We got the 5% cut in this cycle for this year, and we'll see it again next year. But I think all eyes are already on that next budgeting process for the biennium, with the release of the budget guidance this week for many state agencies. And so that combined, I think there's two facets here I'd like to ask you about. One, combined with demographic growth, which Texas has seemed to be challenged with over and over again, with having the revenue to keep up with that growth. Some of our highest items in our state budget overall are education, Medicaid, healthcare, looking at those areas. But as you've shown, and every Texan has, and other data shows, it's just not enough. What do you see are some of the risk and challenges here going into this session, knowing that we're probably going to see some budget constraints in place? And maybe what are some ideas do you see? What are some things the state could do? I know as an organization, you've advocated for a number of changes to the way that we do our revenue system in the state.
Yeah, so let me say first and foremost that the revenue shortfall is a policy decision. It is not inevitable. It's not something that has to be done. It's a choice that policymakers are going to be confronted with, and it doesn't need to happen. So first and foremost, I would say the Economic Stabilization Fund, often referred to as the Rainy Day Fund, was designed specifically for this purpose. We have seen in years past where legislators say, no, you're only supposed to use the Rainy Day Fund when it's a weather-related crisis, which is completely not true to its historic. And then when it's an economic recession and we want to use it, they say, or the opposite, when it's a weather-related event, they say, no, it's really supposed to be used for an economic recession. So they'll flip-flop depending on the session. Ultimately, the Economic Stabilization Fund purpose is to provide the relief when the revenue is short for a short time session, so that you don't have to cut public education, you don't have to cut healthcare services, so the families don't suffer, and you can expedite the recovery. The more people you have that aren't able to get access to healthcare or to food or to education, or particularly the industry that really gets hurt the most during these recessions is the higher education industry, and specifically the students, because there will be cuts to Texas grants, which are not constitutionally protected. And that means that those students aren't going to get the skills necessary to get the good jobs down the road. You're decreasing the investment on economic growth long term. So first and foremost, we got to use the rainy day fund, the Economic Stabilization Fund. Secondly, there are a bunch of revenue options. We got to grow the pie through using different revenue sources. And one I'll mention real quickly is these chapter 313 chapters, where we give corporate tax cuts to corporations who are coming to Texas. A study has found that many of these corporations will be coming without those tax cuts, and then the school districts who are relying on those tax cuts, they get paid they get held harmless by the state. But at the end of the day, the state is footing the bill for these tax cuts, which is reducing our overall revenue. That is an inequitable system, because these corporations are not the ones who need it the most. The school districts could be getting that money directly from the corporations. And as we have, you demonstrated through study after study, the tax cuts are not what's driving the companies to come. A lot of times it's because of the geography of what is provided in the state, the access to the oil or to the fuel or whatever they need is only available in that area. So that's just an example. There's a whole bunch of different ways to increase revenue, but we're going to have to think outside the box and take some tough decisions to get that done. And that's why we say it's about policy. It's about those decisions, and it's not an inevitable situation that we have to cut services to families.
Just staying on that for just a moment, because I know we come back to this in our classes a lot of time, and looking at the long-term picture and knowing that that's very significant challenge in Texas to look at any kind of major constitutional reform that might pave the way to changes in fiscal policy. And what I mean by that is, I think this as well, is that our revenue system is so constricted by the way it's set up and what the legislature can or can't do. There's not any really movement. I always tell my students there are not people with pitchforks and torches on the stairs of the Capitol in Austin claiming for constitutional reform, wanting constitutional reform. But so there are others out there who've said that we need to make some incremental changes or short-term changes, because just the revenue is not keeping up with demographic growth. And thus these kind of essential services that we see in education and healthcare, others are just continuing to fall behind. They're not sufficient for what we need. Where do you fall? Where does every Texan fall in that, and seeing what are some of the things that we could look at changing that might have an impact and not have a more devastating impact on the people who are struggling with the resources or the services that we have?
I think people need to connect those dots. So you're right. There aren't people, breaking down the Capitol doors, asking for, constitutional provision changes or, tax and policy change. But what they are clamoring for is access to higher education, right? Parents and kids are being completely priced out of higher education. They are asking for teacher pay raises, where teachers are, struggling to make a living, particularly in certain parts of Texas. We know rural communities are really feeling the effects of education costs and healthcare costs, and not having access to hospitals and healthcare because the hospitals are closing down or they're too far away to get access to. So when you connect the dots between the services and the funding, people realize that we do need fundamental changes to our tax and policy proposals. And what we call it is updating and modernizing our tax code. Give an example, natural gas was originally given this big tax cut because of the economy that what it was created in. Now we're in a completely different economy, and so maybe it's time to update it. Gasoline tax hasn't been updated for inflation in decades. I think it was in the early 90s, the last time it was updated. And so it's not really about like changing the entire thing, but it's about updating it, modernizing it, making it more reflective of the economy that we're in and the actual needs that we're in. As you mentioned, demographics have changed the circumstances, the industries have changed, inflation has changed. So we just updated our tax code. We would be in a much better position, and it wouldn't require a complete revamping of everything. An update would get us, pretty far along the way.
Very good. Yes, and that might be more incremental and might be more likely to happen if we can look at that. I wanted to just kind of turn this a little bit, still stay focused on every Texan and what you do, but I think a lot of people or listeners, and I see this with students in the classroom as well, when they look at the legislature and the legislative process, they think, everybody gathered in a room, they talk about it, and then they take a vote. And from your experience that it's a much more engaged and intense process than that. Where are your efforts on behalf of every Texan? What does it really take to get started with the issues that you will be focused on in this next legislative session? We've got an election coming up. What will you be doing between now and the opening of the session and even beyond that in order to try to move some of these issues forward?
Absolutely. And it's such a crossroads time. We will potentially have a new speaker. I mean, we will have a new speaker because the current speaker has not run for re-election. There's a potential that the House will change parties, the Texas House, that is. We potentially have a new president. It's a census year, which, is going to make a huge difference in the districts, how they're composed. We go into redistricting. And we're going into this environment in the COVID pandemic situation. So it is going to be, a session to remember for sure going into January. Our focus is a lot based on the movements. The movements are growing around the state. And so, access to healthcare, I think, is a movement. Last session, it was a session of school finance. And for sure, we're going to be doing work on school finance. We want to make sure that those funding levels stay there and are become more equitable. But healthcare is a movement that's growing. We have a campaign called Sick of It TX because people are sick and tired of not being able to access healthcare coverage. They're tired of rural hospitals closing down. They're tired of having to pay these huge costs. One thing we were able to address a little bit was surprise billing in hospitals, but it only affected the state system. We need that on the federal level as well. And so access to unemployment, we see on Congress, we're still waiting for the unemployment benefits to be extended. We know there's an executive order, but we know that has fallen way short of what's needed. And so we know this session is a real opportunity because of the things I mentioned, the potential changing of leadership, at least on the House side. Even on the Senate side, there's a potential change there because, under the rules of the Senate, the 3/5 rule, which blocks legislation from coming to the floor, the Democrats may be in position to be able to block legislation again, which means that more conversations will be opening up. There'll be maybe more bipartisan efforts even on the Senate side. And I think the COVID environment has changed the environment. Now, you can't just pretend that the healthcare crisis is something that can be ignored. It's first and foremost in people's mind. And the budget revenue is real. The revenue shortfall is real. So people are going to be looking for ways to generate revenue in an equitable manner. And so this is real opportunities to make those big changes or even incremental changes that can fundamentally alter the lives of people of color, disadvantaged communities, Texans across the board, and not just about, the rich getting richer.
I'll always ask for encouragement or guidance here for our listeners. I'm really big on civic engagement. We teach that. That's our focus in our government classes, is trying to not just give students knowledge, but to help them be responsible members of society and to know, hey, how do I get engaged? And so with your broad range of experience and what you're doing, what do you communicate to people about how they can be more engaged with these critical issues and then not just know about them, but to take that step beyond them, maybe in their own communities or on the state or national level, and try to have some influence and make a difference?
Absolutely. I mean, I can't express the importance of participating in the census. This year, every Texan has really been trying to push that out. That is fundamental in terms of your representation, the federal funding that comes in, the businesses that come in. And then there's a common phrase you hear at the Capitol, and it's a cliche, but legislators say it all the time: elections matter. And if you come out to vote and you change the incumbent, or the incumbent stays, that is a referendum that legislators at all levels will use to justify their positions. That if you vote out the guy or the woman that's there, then that means the change needs to happen. That there's a movement that's growing. If the incumbent stays by a big margin, then that's a sign that things are going good and people want to stay the same. And then actually activating with the legislators. I worked in the Senate office, as you mentioned, 3 sessions. If we got 3 to 5 calls, just 3 to 5 calls, we flagged that for our senators. Say, hey, you're getting called on this issue. This is what it's particularly if they're in district constituents. We flagged for the senator, hey, you're getting calls on this issue. This is something that's rising up. It doesn't take hundreds of calls and hundreds of emails to make a difference. If you get a few of your like-minded, constituents, friends, neighbors, you can really, make an impact and let your legislator know. And especially in this session where access to the Capitol is going to be very limited, those emails, those phone calls, those social media posts are going to be the way the legislators are gauging, what is happening in their districts and what people care about. This is, like I said, I think a real opportunity for folks to make their voices heard. And the more you engage with the census, voting, and contacting your members, it could really make a big difference.
Very good. Well, thank you for that encouragement. And then that's what we continually tell people through this show and this format is to be engaged. Luis, I want to thank you for joining us today. We've had the opportunity to interview Luis Figueroa, the Legislative and Policy Director for Every Texan, and we'll post the link to Every Texan on our Facebook page so that people can look at the work and the policy issues and the advocacy that you're doing. And we will also be looking at these issues in the upcoming session to follow them and see what are some of the things that may be addressed in this next session of the Texas Legislature. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Happy to do it anytime.
This has been a Tarleton Radio Network podcast with production from AJ Heyer and Taylor Welch. Find more great shows by searching Tarleton Radio Network wherever you get your podcasts.